As you rest and let your breathing slow, imagine yourself drifting back across the centuries, further and further, until time itself begins to blur. The noise of the modern world softens, replaced by the quiet rhythm of waves against a distant shore, the rustling of olive trees swaying in the wind, and the faint echoes of lyres strummed in forgotten halls. We are in an age when gods and mortals walked close together. An age of heroes, of kingdoms rising beside the sea, of myths that shaped the world's imagination. And at the heart of this age, far before the clash of spears and the burning of Troy, lies a simple event, a wedding. Yet this was no ordinary wedding, for from its joy and splendor would spring a war destined to echo across eternity. The tale begins with Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea goddess of shimmering beauty. She was a daughter of the old man of the sea, bound to the endless tides. But Thetis had caught the gaze of Zeus himself, the mighty ruler of Olympus. The gods, however, are not blind to fate, and an oracle had spoken, Thetis will bear a son greater than his father. Even Zeus, lord of thunder, trembled at the thought of being overthrown by his own child. And so, in a rare moment of humility, he stepped aside. Instead of claiming Thetis for himself, Zeus decreed she would marry a mortal, ensuring that her son's greatness would belong to men, not gods. And thus the wedding was arranged. The sea goddess and the mortal king joined in a union that would blend immortality with human destiny. Picture now the scene, Mount Pelion, in Thessaly, where the feast was held. Imagine the twilight sky streaked in shades of rose and gold, the sea shimmering below. Tables overflowed with ambrosia, golden cups brimming with nectar. The Olympian gods themselves gathered in splendor. Zeus with his thunderbolt resting beside him, Hera seated proudly at his side, Athena in gleaming armor, and Aphrodite radiant as dawn. All the immortals were invited save one, Eris, the goddess of strife. For who would invite discord to a wedding? Yet Eris, unbowed and bitter, came unbidden. In her hand she carried a golden apple, polished to a gleam, inscribed with 3 words, "To the fairest." She cast it into the banquet hall, and in an instant, celebration turned to rivalry. The apple was claimed by 3, Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire. Each insisted she was most deserving of the title, and none would yield. A quarrel broke out, voices rising, pride unbending. Zeus, unwilling to choose between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of beauty, turned aside. Instead, he decreed that a mortal man would decide, and so the choice fell not to a god, but to a shepherd prince far away on the slopes of Mount Ida near Troy. His name was Paris, son of Priam, king of Troy. Let yourself picture Paris, young, graceful, and unknowing of the burden soon placed upon him. In the quiet of the hills, among grazing flocks, Hermes, the messenger god, appeared before him leading the 3 radiant goddesses. Each in turn offered Paris a bribe, for divine beauty does not stand without ambition. Hera promised him power, dominion over vast kingdoms, the throne of Asia itself. Athena promised him wisdom and glory in war, the triumph of a hero unmatched in battle. But Aphrodite leaned close, her voice soft as a whisper carried by the breeze, and promised him love, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And so Paris, swayed by desire, placed the golden apple in Aphrodite's hand. Far away in Sparta dwelt Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, famed as the fairest mortal ever born. Her beauty was so dazzling that princes across Greece had once quarreled for her hand. To prevent bloodshed, her stepfather, King Tyndareus, had made all her suitors swear a solemn oath, that whoever won Helen's hand, all others would defend that union if ever it were threatened. Helen's chosen husband was Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother to Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae. Their union brought peace for a time, but the choice of Paris, guided by Aphrodite, would soon unravel it all. With Aphrodite's promise stirring his heart, Paris sailed to Sparta, welcomed as a guest beneath Menelaus's roof. But as often in these ancient tales, hospitality became betrayal. Whether Helen was persuaded by Aphrodite's spell, or whether she followed Paris willingly, the outcome was the same. She departed with him for Troy, leaving behind her husband, her home, and a kingdom shamed. When Menelaus returned and found his wife gone, his grief turned swiftly to fury. He called upon the oath, summoning all those who had once sought Helen's hand. From every corner of Greece they gathered, kings, warriors, cunning men, and reluctant heroes, bound by honor, bound by oath, bound by fate. And here, pause for a moment and feel the weight of what has been set into motion. For this was not simply a matter of a stolen bride. It was the weaving of destiny by gods who quarreled above and mortals who chose below. The seers and oracles had long foretold that Troy, proud city by the sea, would one day fall in flames, that the union of Thetis and Peleus would bear a son destined for immortal fame, Achilles, greatest warrior of the Greeks, though doomed to a brief life. That Paris, prince of Troy, would bring ruin to his own people through the choices of his heart. The wedding that began with laughter, music, and the clinking of goblets had planted seeds of grief that would span a decade of war, shatter heroes, and inspire poets for thousands of years to come. And so as you drift deeper into rest, picture that apple still gleaming with golden light. A simple fruit cast by a goddess of discord, yet carrying within it the fate of cities and the destiny of heroes. From joy to envy, from envy to desire, from desire to war, this is how the great story begins. The music of the feast fades now, the laughter softens, and the flickering torches of Mount Pelion grow dim in your mind. Ahead lies the call of the Greek kings, the mustering of armies, and the clash upon the shores of Troy. But for now, let your mind settle gently, knowing you stand at the threshold of legend, where myth and memory entwine. The seeds of war are sown. Soon the world will burn with the wrath of gods and men. Yet for this moment, rest in the quiet before the storm, and let sleep carry you deeper into the story. Paris, son of Priam, left the quiet slopes of Mount Ida behind and sailed across the wine-dark sea. His heart burned with the promise of Aphrodite, and his destiny carried him towards Sparta. The winds were kind, as though even the gods of the sea bent to the will of love and war. His ship cut across the waters, its prow adorned with the carved figure of a horse, its sail white in the sun. In Sparta, King Menelaus welcomed Paris with all the warmth of Greek hospitality. A guest was sacred, shielded by Zeus himself, and no stranger was turned away from the feasting table. Paris was treated not as a foreigner, but as a friend. He sat in Menelaus's hall among warriors and courtiers, listening to the voices of singers who told of ancient battles. Golden bowls were passed, filled with wine as dark as blood, and the flickering of torches cast shadows on the polished walls. And there among the carved pillars and tapestries, Paris first looked upon Helen. She was more than beautiful. Her presence seemed to carry the light of dawn itself. Her hair glimmered like burnished bronze. Her eyes were deep as the Aegean, her grace greater than any mortal's. She had been born of Zeus and Leda, a union of god and mortal, and that divine spark was visible in every glance. It is said that Paris was struck silent when he saw her, and that Aphrodite herself whispered courage into his heart. For no mortal, unassisted, could hope to win the heart of Helen, most desired of all women. Some say she looked upon Paris with equal wonder, moved not by spell but by some hidden longing within her own spirit. Others say that it was the goddess's enchantment that softened her will. Whatever truth lies in the shadowed past, Helen listened to Paris's words, and her heart swayed like the sails of his ship. Menelaus was soon called away, bound for Crete on matters of state. He left Helen in the care of his household, never imagining that within his own walls destiny was already at work. When Paris spoke to Helen, he spoke not as a guest, but as a suitor, bold and unashamed. He told her of Troy, of its high walls that gleamed like ivory in the sun, of its towers rising above the plain, of Priam's court, where princes and princesses shone like stars. And he told her of his love, a love promised, he said, by the gods themselves. In the stillness of night, Helen chose. Whether compelled by Aphrodite's charm or drawn by Paris's words, she resolved to leave behind her husband, her kingdom, and the land of her birth. She stepped aboard Paris's ship, her jewels glittering in the starlight. her robes trailing like waves of silk. Servants and treasures were carried with her, for Paris did not leave empty-handed. As the ship slipped away from the Spartan shore, the winds rose again, carrying Helen eastward toward the fate of Troy. Behind her, the halls of Menelaus stood silent, unaware that they had lost their queen. When Menelaus returned and found Helen gone, grief and fury consumed him. He tore at his hair and robes, cursing the guest who had broken sacred trust, the wife who had betrayed her vows, and the goddess who must surely have had a hand in it. Yet anger alone could not reclaim her. It was then that Menelaus called upon the oath sworn years before, when Helen's suitors had gathered to win her hand. Bound by honor, each had sworn to defend her marriage should it ever be violated. One by one, messengers were sent across Greece, summoning kings and warriors to fulfill their pledge. From Ithaca came Odysseus, cunning and reluctant, preferring his hearth to war, yet bound by the oath. From Pylos came Nestor, old and wise, eager to guide younger men with counsel. From Salamis came Ajax, towering and unyielding, famed for his strength. From Argos came Diomedes, bold and fearless. And from Phthia came Achilles, still young, still untested, but already whispered to be unmatched in battle. He was the son of Peleus and Thetis, the very child foretold to surpass his father, a warrior destined for immortal fame, though his life would be short. At their head stood Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus, king of kings, lord of Mycenae. It was Agamemnon who took command of the host, his pride as great as his authority, eager to extend his power across the sea. Together they gathered at Aulis, their ships drawn up like a forest of masts, their armies filling the shore with the clamor of men and arms. Yet the winds would not rise, and the fleet could not sail. Seers spoke of Artemis, angered by a slight, and demanded a sacrifice. Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon. With a heavy heart, Agamemnon agreed, placing ambition and duty above his child. The tale differs in its telling. Some say the goddess pitied the girl and carried her away, leaving a phantom in her place. Others say she died upon the altar, her cries swallowed by the sea breeze. Whatever the truth, the sacrifice was made, and the winds returned. The ships launched at last, sails billowing, oars dipping in rhythm as the greatest armada Greece had ever known set forth. Across the sea they went, hundreds of vessels carrying tens of thousands of men, driven by oath, by pride, and by vengeance. Their destination was Troy, rich city of the east, whose walls soared above the plain, whose princes had dared to steal the queen of Sparta. And so, from a single choice made on a lonely hillside, the fate of nations had turned. Paris, guided by desire and divine promise, had carried Helen to Troy. Menelaus, bound by grief and rage, had summoned all Greece to arms. And the gods, divided in their loyalties, looked down from Olympus, ready to weave their will into the tapestry of mortal struggle. Ahead lay years of blood and glory, of sorrow and triumph, of heroes who would be remembered in song long after their bones had turned to dust. For the abduction of Helen was no mere theft of a woman. It was the spark that would ignite the most storied war of the ancient world, a war where love and wrath, honor and betrayal, gods and men, would meet upon the same battlefield. And so the ships pressed on, their prows cutting through the dark waters, toward the shores where destiny waited. The winds filled the sails, and the Greek fleet gathered like a storm across the Aegean. From every kingdom came warriors, kings and champions, drawn together by oath, by duty, and by the tangled threads of fate. Their ships lined the shores of Aulis, the beach crowded with men preparing for the greatest war the world had ever known. One by one, the heroes of Greece appeared, each carrying his own story, his own destiny. There was Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, proud and ambitious, whose hunger for power matched his role as commander of all the Greeks. He stood at the center, draped in purple, his voice commanding, his will unbending. Beside him was Menelaus, king of Sparta, husband wronged, his heart burning with grief for Helen. His fury gave the war its cause, but it was his brother's authority that gave it form. Then came Odysseus, king of Ithaca, clever and cautious. At first he had tried to avoid the summons. Disguising his reluctance, he feigned madness, yoking ox and donkey to the same plough and sowing salt upon his fields. But the Greeks saw through his ruse. When Palamedes laid Odysseus's infant son Telemachus before the plough, the father could not strike his child. And so Odysseus was bound to join, his cunning destined to shape the war as much as any sword. From Salamis came Ajax the Great, a towering figure broad as a wall, unmatched in size and strength. His shield was as large as a door, his courage steadfast. He was the might of Greece given form, a man who would stand unshaken when others faltered. With him came Ajax the Lesser, smaller in stature but swift and fierce, his pride driving him to rashness that would in time bring ruin. From Pylos arrived Nestor, aged but wise, his hair silver, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles long past. He was too old to fight as he once had, but his counsel would steady younger hearts. His words flowed like a river, calm and endless, guiding the Greeks with patience and memory. From Argos came Diomedes, fierce and fearless, still young but already burning with ambition. In the war to come, he would prove himself bold enough to wound even gods upon the battlefield. And then came Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the child foretold by prophecy. Though still in the bloom of youth, his presence already outshone the others. His mother had hidden him, for she knew his fate, to live a long and quiet life, or a brief one blazing with eternal glory. She disguised him among maidens on the island of Skyros, hoping to keep him safe. But Odysseus, clever as always, uncovered him by trickery, laying weapons among the women's trinkets. When Achilles seized a sword, his destiny was revealed, and he was brought forth to join the war. Achilles was not alone. At his side stood Patroclus, his dearest companion, bound to him by friendship deeper than words. Together they came with 50 ships of Myrmidons, fierce warriors from Thessaly, their black armor gleaming, their hearts bound to their leader's fate. As the hosts gathered, the beach became a living forest of masts and sails, stretching further than the eye could see. The sound of hammers echoed as men repaired their ships, the clash of bronze rang as armor was fitted, the neighing of horses rose into the salt-filled air. Fires burned by night, and by day the shore was alive with drills, speeches, and sacrifices to the gods. But the gods as ever demanded their price. Artemis, angered by Agamemnon's pride, had stilled the winds, leaving the fleet stranded. The seer Calchas declared that only the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, would appease the goddess. With heavy heart, or perhaps with ambition stronger than love, Agamemnon consented. The girl was brought to Aulis under the pretense of marriage to Achilles, only to be led to the altar. Some say the knife fell, and her blood darkened the ground. Others whisper that Artemis, pitying the maiden, snatched her away in a whirlwind and left a phantom in her place. Whatever the truth, when the ritual was done, the winds returned, filling the sails of the Greeks, and the fleet at last was free to depart. It was a sight that lived in legend. More than 1,000 ships, their sails white against the sea, carrying kings and heroes across the waters to the shores of Troy. The oars dipped in perfect rhythm, drums beat, and voices rose in chant as the greatest expedition of the ancient world set forth. As they sailed, each man carried his own vision of what lay ahead. For some, glory; for others, riches; for a few, only duty. Yet none could escape the pull of destiny, for the path to Troy was one already woven by the hands of gods. High upon Olympus, the immortals looked down, divided in their favor. Hera and Athena, spurned by Paris, plotted vengeance against Troy. Aphrodite, victorious in the judgment, shielded Paris with all her charm. Zeus alone sought balance, weighing the fates, allowing events to unfold as destiny decreed. And so the heroes of Greece, bound together by oath and desire, set their course eastward. The sea carried them closer to the walls of Troy, closer to the city that would become the grave of kings, the cradle of legends, and the stage upon which gods and mortals alike would test the limits of pride, of wrath, and of love. The muster was complete. The greatest war of myth and memory had begun its march toward history. Across the restless waters of the Aegean, the Greek fleet advanced like a forest of white wings. 1,000 ships cut through the waves, their sails swollen with the breath of the gods, their prows pointed east toward destiny. On the decks stood warriors, armored in bronze, shields strapped tight, spears gleaming in the sun. Songs rose from the oarsmen, chants to keep rhythm, prayers to steady courage. The sea itself seemed to shiver with anticipation. At last the coast of Asia came into view, a long line of sand stretching before the Greeks. Beyond it, the plain of Troy lay broad and fertile, its fields golden with grain, its rivers winding like silver threads, and above it all rose the walls of Troy, high, proud and unyielding. They were said to have been built by the hands of gods, by Poseidon and Apollo themselves, towering so strong that no army of mortals could hope to breach them. From afar, they gleamed in the morning light, a fortress that seemed eternal. The Greeks beached their ships with thunderous force, the prows grinding into the sand, the surf foaming around them. Warriors leapt ashore, shouting their war cries, planting their spears in the ground as though claiming the land itself. But even in that first rush, fate demanded its toll. For it had been foretold that the first Greek to set foot upon Trojan soil would be the first to fall. That fate fell to Protesilaus, a noble warrior, eager and brave. He leapt ashore ahead of all others, his spear lifted high, his armor gleaming. For a moment he stood triumphant upon the beach, the first of the Greeks to challenge Troy. But in an instant, a Trojan spear struck, and Protesilaus crumpled to the sand, his lifeblood staining the shore. His sacrifice was the opening wound of a war that would bleed for 10 long years. From the gates of Troy came its defenders, led by princes whose names would live in legend. Foremost among them was Hector, eldest son of King Priam, husband of Andromache, father of little Astyanax. Hector was no god, no immortal, yet he bore himself with a nobility greater than any. He fought not for conquest or glory, but for his city, his family, and the future of his people. His presence gave courage to the Trojans, and his spear was feared even among the greatest of the Greeks. Beside him fought Aeneas, a younger prince, descended from the goddess Aphrodite herself. Though his fate lay not in the survival of Troy, but in distant lands and future empires, already the gods were shaping his path. And so the war began not with the fall of walls, but with clashes upon the plain. Skirmishes broke out near the ships, the clang of bronze on bronze filling the air. Spears flew, arrows whistled, shields rang like drums. The gods themselves took their places, unseen yet ever present. Athena guided Greek hands, steadying their strikes. Apollo walked among the Trojans, filling their hearts with fire. Zeus, from his throne on Olympus, watched in silence, allowing destiny to unfold. The Greeks built a camp by the shore, their ships drawn up behind walls of timber and trench. From this base they would launch their assaults, hoping to wear down Troy through battle and blockade. Yet even as they fought, the city's gates stood firm, its towers unshaken. For Troy was more than stone. It was pride, tradition, and the will of a people who would not yield. Years passed in this way, the war dragging on with no end in sight. Heroes clashed in single combat, armies surged and fell back, and the land between the ships and the walls grew soaked with blood. Neither side could claim victory. The Greeks, though many, could not breach the city's defenses. The Trojans, though valiant, could not drive the invaders back to the sea. It was a stalemate, a grinding war of attrition, and beneath it all, resentments and rivalries began to stir among the Greeks themselves. For within their camp, ambition and pride burned as fiercely as any torch. Agamemnon, High King, demanded obedience. Yet his arrogance would soon ignite a quarrel greater than any fought upon the plain. A quarrel that would draw wrath from the greatest warrior of them all and change the course of the war forever. The shores of Troy had been claimed. The war had begun in earnest. And though the walls still stood tall against the sky, already the seeds of ruin had been sown, not only within the city of Troy but within the hearts of its besiegers. For years the Greek camp stood upon the shore, a forest of masts behind a wall of timber, and each season brought new clashes upon the plain of Troy. Armies surged forward and fell back again, their cries mingling with the clash of bronze and the thunder of chariots. Heroes fought in single combat beneath the gaze of their comrades, and though many were wounded or slain, still the city stood. The war was a grinding stalemate. The Greeks, though numerous and fierce, could not breach the high walls of Troy. The Trojans, though valiant and inspired by Hector, could not drive the invaders back into the sea. The land between the city and the shore became a field of bones, its soil soaked with blood, its rivers clogged with broken shields. Seasons changed, and still the conflict raged on. It was not only men who struggled there. The gods themselves strode the battlefield, unseen by mortal eyes, yet shaping every clash. Athena guided the spears of the Greeks, filling their hearts with courage. Apollo shielded the Trojans, striking sickness into the Greek camp when angered. Hera plotted from her throne, Poseidon lent his strength, and Ares delighted in the slaughter. Yet Zeus, high above all, held the balance, weighing the fates of men as though upon a scale. But among the Greeks it was not the strength of Troy alone that threatened their cause. Pride and quarrel within their own camp nearly broke them. For Agamemnon, the High King, let his arrogance overflow. He claimed authority over all, and in his hunger for power, he insulted the one warrior he could least afford to anger. Achilles, son of Thetis, leader of the Myrmidons, was unmatched in battle. His very presence struck fear into the Trojans, and his spear had turned the tide of countless skirmishes. Yet Agamemnon, seizing a war prize of his own, demanded another. And when he was denied, he humiliated Achilles before the gathered host. He took from him Briseis, the maiden who had been given to Achilles as a token of honor. Before the eyes of all, Achilles was dishonored. His heart, already fierce, now burned with wrath. Yet he did not strike Agamemnon. Instead, he withdrew. He declared that he would no longer fight for the Greeks, that he would let them fall without his aid, so that they might learn the cost of insulting their greatest champion. Achilles returned to his tent, his hands clenched upon his knees, his spirit raging like fire. Beside him, the Myrmidons sat idle, their black armor gleaming, their spears at rest. And without them, without him, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans surged from their gates, Hector at their head, his chariot flashing across the plain. He pressed the Greeks back to their ships, driving them with fire and spear. The cry of battle reached the very shore, and flames began to lick at the wooden hulls of the Greek fleet. In those days the Greeks knew fear as they had never known it before. For without Achilles, they were vulnerable, and without his wrath turned against their enemies, they felt the war slipping from their grasp. Some begged him to return, to forgive Agamemnon's insult, but Achilles only sat in silence, his mind darkened with fury, his pride as unyielding as iron. In the stillness of his tent, he called upon his mother, Thetis of the silver feet, goddess of the sea. He begged her to intercede with Zeus, to tilt the scales of fate against the Greeks, so that they would suffer in his absence. Thetis rose from the depths of the sea, shimmering in her sorrow, and she carried his plea to the king of gods. And Zeus, though reluctant, agreed. For the will of fate was already moving, and the grief of Achilles was woven into the destiny of Troy. And so the war tilted as Achilles had wished. The Trojans pressed harder, the Greeks faltered, and the walls of their camp shook with the roar of battle. Yet in that wrathful silence of Achilles, in his refusal to fight, lay the seeds of an even greater tragedy. For wrath is not so easily contained, and grief not so easily silenced. Soon the pain of loss would call him back to the field, and when he returned, the plain of Troy would quake beneath his fury. The war dragged on, and without Achilles the Greeks were pressed to the edge of ruin. The Trojans, emboldened by his absence, stormed across the plain under the command of Hector. Their chariots thundered forward, their spears rained down, and the Greeks found themselves driven back to their very ships. Fire licked at the timbers, smoke curled into the sky, and panic spread like a tide among the warriors. Within his tent, Achilles listened to the cries of battle, his heart torn between fury and duty. He had sworn not to fight, for his pride still smouldered with Agamemnon's insult. Yet he could not close his ears to the suffering of his comrades, nor to the sound of the Trojans' triumph. And beside him stood Patroclus, his dearest companion, whose heart ached to see the Greeks brought so low. Patroclus pleaded with Achilles, not for himself but for the men who were falling. He begged to take the field in Achilles' place, not as himself, but clad in Achilles' own armor. If the Trojans saw him gleaming in that bronze, they would think their greatest enemy had returned, and fear would drive them back. At first Achilles resisted, for he knew the risks, and his love for Patroclus was deeper than words. But at last, moved by loyalty and desperation, He agreed. He placed his armor upon Patroclus's shoulders, the shining greaves, the great shield, the plumed helmet that caught the sun. The sight of him was like a vision of Achilles himself, a figure of awe and dread. Achilles gave his companion one command: drive the Trojans from the ships, save the Greeks from ruin, but do not go further. Do not scale the walls of Troy, nor press too deep into the fight. For destiny is cruel to those who overreach, and Achilles knew that the fates watched closely. With the Myrmidons at his back, Patroclus surged forth. The cry of their charge split the air like thunder. The Trojans, seeing the armor of Achilles flashing before them, faltered in terror. They believed the great warrior had returned, his wrath unleashed, and they broke beneath the assault. Patroclus drove them from the Greek camp, from the burning ships, across the plain in wild retreat. The tide had turned, if only for a moment. The Trojans fled, and the Greeks found their courage renewed. Chariots overturned, warriors fell, and the ground was littered with broken spears. Patroclus fought with a fury not his own, as though Achilles himself had entered his spirit. But Patroclus, carried by triumph, forgot the warning of his friend. He pressed onward, beyond the ships, beyond the safety of his command. He drove the Trojans back to their very walls, his spear striking down foe after foe. He even faced Sarpedon, son of Zeus, and though the gods wept for him, Sarpedon fell beneath Patroclus's hand. It was then, at the very gates of Troy, that his fate came upon him. For Apollo, watching from the heights, struck him from behind. The god's hand was unseen, but its force was terrible. Patroclus staggered, his spear broken, his strength waning. His helmet, the helmet of Achilles, tumbled to the ground, and in that moment he was revealed not as the son of Peleus, but as himself. Seizing the chance, Hector advanced. With a thrust of his spear, he struck Patroclus down. The young warrior fell upon the plain, his life ebbing away, his last thoughts filled with the name of Achilles. With his dying breath, he foretold Hector's own doom, for by killing him, Hector had sealed his fate. The Trojans exulted, stripping the fallen of Achilles' armor, their spirits lifted by the sight of Greece's hope destroyed. Yet for the Greeks, despair was a shroud. When the news reached Achilles, grief like none he had ever known seized him. His cries rang out so fierce that even the sea goddess Thetis rose from the deep to comfort him. The wrath of Achilles, long withheld, now flared into something unstoppable. Pride, insult, even his quarrel with Agamemnon, all were burned away by sorrow. He cared nothing for honor, nothing for spoils. His heart desired only vengeance, only Hector's blood upon the ground. And so the world trembled, for the greatest warrior of Greece would return to battle, and when he did, no wall, no army, not even the gods themselves, could stand against the fury that grief had awoken. The death of Patroclus fell upon the Greek camp like a shadow. Warriors who had faced 10 years of battle without faltering now bowed their heads in grief. The Myrmidons wept beside their silent ships, their black armor dulled by sorrow. Yet none mourned as deeply as Achilles. When the body of Patroclus was carried back from the field, stripped of the armor that had once been his own, Achilles fell to the ground in anguish. He poured dust upon his head, tearing his hair, his voice crying out so loud that it echoed over the plain. Even the Trojans heard his wail and trembled, for they knew what his grief foretold. Thetis, his mother, rose from the depths of the sea to comfort him. She cradled her son, though she knew no comfort could ease the torment in his heart. He had chosen wrath once before, when Agamemnon had dishonored him. Now he chose it again, but this time it was not pride that drove him, but love and loss. He swore to avenge Patroclus, to strike Hector down, even though he knew it would hasten his own death. For Achilles was no stranger to prophecy. From his youth he had known the choice laid before him, a long, quiet life forgotten by men, or a short life of glory, his name remembered forever. By returning to battle, he embraced the second path. His days would be few, but they would blaze like fire. Thetis, sorrowful yet loyal, sought aid for her son. She ascended to Olympus and begged the god Hephaestus to forge new armor for Achilles, since Hector now bore the old. The smith god, lame yet mighty, labored at his forge, and what he created was beyond compare. A shield vast as a world, upon which he engraved the images of all life, fields and cities, dances and harvests, the sun and moon, the constellations above. Upon this shield, the fullness of existence was displayed, as though Achilles would carry all creation into battle. When Thetis returned, she placed the armor before her son. Its bronze shone like liquid fire, so bright that none of the Greeks could look upon it without awe. Achilles rose, and as he donned the armor, his grief hardened into wrath. The Myrmidons gathered around him once more, their courage rekindled by the sight of their leader returned. Before he fought, Achilles sought to make peace with Agamemnon. The quarrel that had divided them seemed small now beside the death of Patroclus. Agamemnon too felt the weight of loss and the need for unity. He restored to Achilles the gifts once taken, though Achilles cared little for treasure. He desired only vengeance. When the new dawn rose, Achilles stepped forth from the camp. His voice thundered across the plain, calling out for Hector, declaring that death awaited him. The Trojans, who had rejoiced in victory only a day before, now trembled, for the rage of Achilles was a storm descending upon them. He charged into battle, and none could withstand him. His spear struck down warriors like stalks of grain before the scythe. Chariots overturned, men fled before him, and even the river Scamander rose in fury against him, its waters choked with the bodies he had slain. Yet even the river could not quench his wrath, and with the aid of the gods he broke free, pressing ever closer to Troy. The battlefield became a vision of destruction, and the Trojans knew that only Hector could stand between them and annihilation. For Hector alone had the courage, the duty, and the honor to face the greatest warrior of Greece. And so the stage was set for their fated duel, the noblest defender of Troy against the mightiest champion of the Greeks, a clash not only of men, but of ideals, Hector's loyalty to his people, and Achilles' devotion to his fallen friend. The city of Troy watched from its walls, its people holding their breath as Hector prepared to meet his destiny. The plain of Troy lay silent for a moment, as though the world itself waited. Smoke drifted from the battlefield, the cries of men and horses faded, and in that stillness, two fates drew closer to collision. Within the walls of Troy, Hector stood in his father's halls, the weight of the city upon his shoulders. Priam, his aged father, begged him not to face Achilles, whose wrath was like fire consuming all it touched. Hecuba, his mother, wept, pleading that he remain behind the safety of the walls. Even Andromache, his beloved wife, clutched their young son and begged him to stay, for she feared the day she would be widowed and their child left fatherless. But Hector knew his duty. To retreat would be to abandon his honor, to forsake the city that looked to him for its very survival. He kissed Andromache's hand, touched the head of his son, and stepped into the streets, the sound of lament following him like a shadow. Beyond the gates, Achilles raged across the plain, his new armor gleaming with the brilliance of the sun, his spear striking down every Trojan who dared approach. The gods themselves looked on, divided Apollo shielding the Trojans, Athena guiding the Greeks. Zeus weighed the fates upon his golden scales, and Hector's side sank downward. The moment was set. Hector stood before the Scaean gate waiting. When Achilles drew near, his heart faltered, and for an instant courage gave way to fear. He turned and fled, running around the walls of Troy. Achilles pursued, his footsteps thunderous, his speed unmatched. 3 times they circled the city, one man fleeing, the other relentless. The people watched from the battlements, their eyes wide with dread, as the chase blurred into legend. At last Athena, in the guise of Hector's brother Deiphobus, appeared beside him, urging him to stop. Thinking he was not alone, Hector found his resolve. He turned to face Achilles, spear in hand, his breath steadying, his fate accepted. The two champions stood across from one another, the sun glinting on their bronze. Hector spoke first, offering a pact that whichever man fell, his body would be returned with honor, so that his family might mourn. But Achilles, his heart consumed by grief and fury, refused. He would show no mercy, not after Patroclus' death. The duel began. Hector hurled his spear, but Athena, unseen, guided it aside. He turned to call for another weapon, but found no brother at his side, for the form of Deiphobus was only a trick. Realization struck him. He had been deceived by the goddess, abandoned to face his fate alone. Achilles advanced, his spear poised. Hector drew his sword and rushed forward, striking with all his strength. But Achilles, swifter than any man, found the gap where the collarbone meets the throat and drove his spear deep. The point pierced through, and Hector staggered, the strength leaving his limbs. As he lay dying, he begged Achilles for honor, for the chance that his body be returned to Troy so that his people might mourn him. But Achilles, blinded by wrath, denied him, vowing instead to leave his body for dogs and birds. With his last breath, Hector foretold Achilles' own death, that he too would fall soon upon this plain. Then his spirit fled, and the defender of Troy was no more. Achilles exulted, but his triumph was dark. He pierced Hector's ankles, bound them with thongs, and tied him to his chariot. Before the eyes of the Trojans, who wailed from their walls, he dragged Hector's body across the dust, circling the city in grim display. The noblest of Troy had fallen, and his body, once a symbol of hope, was reduced to spoil. Inside the walls, Priam and Hecuba tore their robes, their cries rising to the heavens. Andromache collapsed, her son clutched in her arms, her life shattered with the fall of her husband. The city itself seemed to groan with grief, knowing that without Hector, its fate was sealed. Yet even in the depths of wrath, humanity would find a way. For this was not the end of Hector's tale, nor the last time his body would be seen. A father's courage, an old man's love would soon soften even the heart of Achilles. But for now the plain of Troy lay heavy with silence, broken only by the grinding of wheels as Hector's lifeless form was dragged through the dust. The death of Hector struck Troy like a thunderbolt. The city that had stood for a decade of war now felt the weight of despair. Their champion, their shield, their hope, was gone. The wails of Priam's daughters echoed through the halls, and Hecuba's grief poured like a river without end. Andromache, clutching her child, sank into silence, for her heart had been shattered beyond tears. Beyond the walls, Achilles still raged. Day after day he dragged Hector's body behind his chariot, circling the camp, circling the city, as though his fury could not be quenched. Yet the gods looked upon this with pity. Apollo shielded Hector's flesh so it would not decay, while Zeus sent messengers among the immortals to remind them that even in vengeance, honor must prevail. For though Achilles was a man, his wrath burned so fiercely it threatened to unbalance the world. At last Priam, king of Troy, found the courage of desperation. Guided by Hermes, he slipped into the Greek camp beneath the cover of night. Old and trembling, he knelt before Achilles, kissing the hands that had slain his son. He begged not as a king, but as a father, pleading for Hector's body to be returned, so that it might rest within Troy's walls. For a moment, silence fell between them. Achilles, who had shown no mercy, felt the echo of his own father's love within Priam's words. His wrath, which had blazed like fire, softened into sorrow. He wept, and with tears came the first measure of peace. At last he relented. Hector's body was washed, anointed with oils, and returned to Troy. Priam carried his son home, and for 9 days the Trojans mourned before they laid him to rest. But fate did not sleep. For Achilles himself was marked. The prophecy that had haunted him since youth now drew near. Paris, guided by Apollo, loosed an arrow that found the one place where Achilles was vulnerable, his heel. The greatest of the Greeks, the mightiest warrior ever to walk the plain of Troy, fell to the earth. His body was borne back to the ships, and the Greek host mourned as though the sun itself had been extinguished. Yet Achilles was not the only hero to fall. Ajax the Great, steadfast and strong, fought with unmatched valor, but pride consumed him. When the arms of Achilles were awarded to Odysseus instead of him, despair overtook his heart. In madness and sorrow, he turned his blade upon himself, his blood soaking the ground he had defended so fiercely. Others too met their ends as the long war ground on. Diomedes, once fearless enough to wound gods, faded from the tale, returning to his lands. Agamemnon would not survive long after Troy, struck down by betrayal in his own halls, and Odysseus, cleverest of them all, would find himself wandering the seas for 10 long years before he saw his home again. Heroes rose, and heroes fell, but the war endured. The walls of Troy still stood unbroken. The Greeks, though wounded by grief and loss, still hungered for victory. And the gods, still divided, continued to weave their threads into the tapestry of fate. The fall of Hector had marked the beginning of Troy's end. The fall of Achilles had sealed the cost of vengeance, and the fall of Ajax had shown how even the strongest could be undone by pride and despair. Each death was a stone pulled from the foundation, each sorrow a crack spreading through the story. Soon the city itself would crumble. But before that final day, there would come a plan unlike any seen before. A trick born not of strength but of cunning. For the Greeks, weary of years of battle, would turn to the craft of Odysseus, and the most famous deception in all of legend would open the gates of Troy. 10 long years had passed since the Greek ships first darkened the shores of Troy. 10 years of battle, of sacrifice, of glory and ruin. The plain was littered with memories, the graves of heroes, the scars of chariots, the ashes of countless fires. Yet still the city stood, its walls high and unbroken, its gates unyielding. The Greeks, weary and desperate, knew that no siege could last forever. Their mightiest champions had fallen, their strength waned with every passing season, but among them was a man whose weapon was not brute force, but cunning, Odysseus, king of Ithaca. It was he who conceived the plan that would turn despair into victory. Instead of storming the walls or burning the gates, he imagined a gift, a deception so bold, so strange, that it would play upon the pride and superstition of the Trojans themselves. The Greeks began to build a great wooden horse, towering, hollow, crafted with care, its sides gleamed with polished timbers. To the eye, it was a marvel, a monument, an offering fit for the gods. Inside its vast belly, however, Odysseus concealed a band of the finest warriors, men chosen for courage and silence, who would wait in darkness until the time was right. When the horse was finished, the Greeks pretended to surrender. They burned their tents, dismantled their camp, and sailed away to a nearby island hiding just beyond the horizon. On the empty beach, only the horse remained, massive and still, as though abandoned in haste. At dawn, the Trojans found it. They poured from their gates in wonder, surrounding the giant figure. Some marveled at its craftsmanship, others whispered that it was a sacred gift, an offering to Athena to atone for the Greeks' failure. Its size awed them, and its presence stirred debate. There were voices of warning. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, cursed with prophecy, never believed, cried out that the horse was doom, that to bring it within the walls would mean destruction. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, spoke with equal force, urging the Trojans to burn it, to smash it to pieces, to trust no gift from their enemies. He hurled his spear into its flank, and the hollow chamber echoed with the sound of hidden armor. But the Trojans did not listen, for fate had turned against them. As Laocoon spoke, 2 great serpents rose from the sea, slithering through the waves with eyes blazing like fire. They coiled around him and his sons, crushing them in their embrace, their cries swallowed by the surf. The Trojans, horrified, saw in this not a warning, but a sign. Laocoon had offended the gods, and the horse must indeed be sacred, and so they rejoiced, dragging the towering figure across the plain. Straining ropes, groaning wheels, and the shouts of men carried it toward the gates. Children laughed, women clapped their hands, and the people of Troy celebrated as though victory had at last been theirs. They pulled the horse into the very heart of the city, placing it beside their temples, proud of their prize. That night the Trojans feasted. They filled their halls with wine and song, praising their deliverance. The Greeks were gone, the siege was ended, and at last, after 10 years of fear and loss, Troy could breathe again. Fires blazed, goblets clinked, and the sound of flutes carried into the night. But when the city slept, the truth of Odysseus's plan was revealed. From the belly of the horse, a hatch opened. Silent as shadows, the warriors descended, their armor glinting faintly in the moonlight. They slipped through the streets, cutting down guards, opening the gates. And from the dark sea came the Greek fleet, returning under cover of night, their ships gliding like phantoms. The gates were thrown wide and the armies poured in. Troy, proud and unbroken for a decade, was taken not by force of arms but by deception. The horse that had seemed a gift was a vessel of ruin, and within its hollow frame had ridden the doom of a city. The streets filled with screams as fire was set to the houses, temples, and towers. The proud walls, once thought eternal, glowed with flame, and the name of Troy, once spoken with awe, began its final descent into tragedy. Night had fallen, and within the walls of Troy, silence lingered after the feasting. The torches burned low, their smoke curling into the sky, and the people lay in drunken sleep, dreaming of peace at last. But outside, beneath the shadow of the stars, the Greeks had returned. Their ships glided across the water, their oars muffled, their sails black against the night. Within the city, Odysseus and his hidden companions crept from the belly of the wooden horse. Their footsteps echoed faintly in the quiet streets as they moved swiftly through the darkened avenues. At the gates, they slew the guards and flung the doors open wide. And from beyond the walls, the Greek army surged like a flood released, pouring into the heart of Troy. The city awoke to fire and steel. Houses blazed, temples toppled. The cries of men and women filled the air. The narrow streets became rivers of flame and blood. The proud towers of Troy, once gleaming in the sun, now glowed red in the fury of destruction. King Priam, old and frail, sought refuge at the altar of Zeus within his palace. But there, in the place of sacred sanctuary, he was struck down by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, his body falling beside the very altar he had trusted. The last king of Troy perished amid ruin, his death the symbol of his city's fall. Hecuba, his queen, was dragged away into captivity, her cries lost in the chaos. Andromache, Hector's widow, clutched her son Astyanax, only to have him torn from her arms. The Greeks feared the boy would grow to avenge his father, and so they cast him from the walls, ending his life before it had begun. The future of Troy was extinguished in a single cruel act. In another corner of the city, Cassandra, cursed prophetess, sought safety in the temple of Athena. But she too was seized, her pleas ignored, her fate sealed as spoil of war. The gods, once her tormentors, now stood silent as her warnings proved true. Even the sacred temples, once thought inviolate, became battlegrounds. Flames climbed their columns, statues of the gods tumbled into rubble. The Greeks spared nothing, for their vengeance had festered for 10 long years, and now it consumed everything before them. Yet in the chaos, one figure moved with destiny at his side. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, carried his aged father Anchises upon his shoulders, while his young son Iülus walked beside him. Guided by the gods, he led a band of survivors through the smoke and ruin, leaving Troy behind. Though the city was lost, its spirit would endure through him, carried across the sea to a future not yet written. By dawn, Troy was no more. Its towers were ash, its gates shattered, its people slain or enslaved. The city that had stood for centuries, that had defied the might of Greece for 10 long years, now lay in ruins. The songs of its glory turned to lament, and its name became a lesson of pride, of fate, and of the cost of war. For the Greeks, the sack was victory, but it was also a curse. Blood had been spilled upon the altars, sacred oaths had been broken, and the gods, though silent, would not forget. In their triumph, the seeds of their own suffering were sown, for few would return home unscathed. But in that moment, as the smoke of Troy rose into the heavens, the war was ended. The city of Priam was no more. And the story that had begun with the promise of a goddess and the choice of a shepherd prince had reached its terrible conclusion in fire and ruin. The flames of Troy still smoldered when the Greeks turned their gaze homeward. After 10 years of battle and bloodshed, they longed for their hearths, for their wives and children, for the lands they had left behind. Their ships, drawn up upon the scarred shore, were repaired and readied, their holds filled with spoils, their decks laden with captives. Yet the journey that lay ahead would prove as fateful as the war itself, for the gods had not forgotten. The sack of Troy had been a victory, but it had also been a desecration. Blood had been spilled upon the very altars, temples had been defiled, and the cries of innocence had risen to the heavens. The Greeks in their triumph had offended the immortals, and so the sea that once carried them swiftly eastward now rose against them in fury as they sought to return west. The tale of their returns was called the Nostoi, the homecomings, though for many, home would never be seen again. Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, sailed back with pride, bringing Cassandra with him as his captive. Yet no welcome awaited him. In his palace, Queen Clytemnestra plotted with her lover Aegisthus, her heart still filled with rage for the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia. When Agamemnon entered his hall, he was struck down, betrayed not by an enemy's spear, but by his own household. The man who had commanded kings fell beneath the hand of his queen, and the curse of his house would linger for generations. Menelaus, the husband whose cause had begun it all, wandered the seas for years, carried by storm and current. Some say he reached the shores of Egypt, where he sought guidance from the gods before he was allowed to return to Sparta. When at last he saw Helen again, the woman for whom the war had been waged, she stood as beautiful as ever, her face unchanged by time. Together they returned to their throne, but their lives were forever haunted by the memory of the countless dead who had fallen for her sake. Ajax the Lesser, who had dishonored Athena's temple in his arrogance, was struck down at sea. A storm shattered his ship, and though he clung to the rocks, Athena herself hurled him into the waves. His name was erased in shame, his memory carried only as a warning. Nestor, wise and aged, alone among the heroes, returned safely to Pylos. His journey was swift, his welcome joyful, for he had never angered the gods. He alone enjoyed the peace of his hearth, honored by his people, and remembered for his counsel. But the most storied journey was that of Odysseus, cunning king of Ithaca. For him the road home became an epic in itself. 10 years of wandering awaited him, through storms and shipwrecks, through the land of the Cyclopes and the halls of Circe, past the song of the sirens, through the straits of Scylla and Charybdis, and into the realm of the dead itself. While Troy had taken 10 years of his life, the sea claimed 10 more before at last he stood again upon the rocky shores of Ithaca. His name became legend, not for the war he fought, but for the trials he endured after it. And what of the others? Some found their homes ruined by strife, their thrones usurped, their families torn apart. Others never returned at all, their bones left in foreign soil, their names forgotten except by poets' songs. The gods had punished the victors as harshly as the defeated, for in their pride and cruelty the Greeks had offended Olympus. Only in the east did a new story begin. Aeneas, who had carried his father upon his back through the burning city, wandered from Troy with his companions. Guided by fate and the will of the gods, he sailed far from the ruins, searching for a land promised to him and his descendants. His path would lead not back to a broken home, but forward to a new destiny, one that would echo centuries later in the founding of Rome. The war was ended, but its shadow stretched long across the world. For the Greeks, the homecomings were not celebrations, but reckonings. For Troy, its ashes gave birth to legends that would never die. And for all who heard the tale, the Nostoi became a reminder that war does not end when the walls fall, but follows its victors home, carried in their hearts, in their curses, and in their fates. The fires of Troy had burned out, but the memory of the war smoldered across the lands of Greece. 10 years of siege, 10 more of wandering, and the loss of countless heroes left scars that time could not erase. Families waited in vain for fathers and sons who would never return. Kingdoms were weakened by the absence of their kings, and though the Greeks had won, their victory came at such cost that it seemed more curse than triumph. In Mycenae, Agamemnon's murder by Clytemnestra cast a shadow over the house of Atreus. His children, Orestes and Electra, would carry the burden of vengeance, their tale entwined with madness and blood, echoing long after Troy's walls had fallen. In Sparta, Menelaus and Helen lived out their days together, their reign outwardly restored, but the whispers of the past never ceased. For many, Helen remained a figure of both awe and blame, the face that had launched 1,000 ships, and the cause of so much ruin. The poets sang of other fates too, of Ajax the Great, brought low by despair, of Diomedes, who returned only to be driven from his land, wandering until he vanished into legend, of Nestor, the rare soul who returned in peace, an old man among younger ghosts, and of Odysseus, whose odyssey became a saga of its own, a story of wit, endurance, and the long yearning for home. But the war was not only remembered in Greece. Beyond its shores the story spread, carried by travelers, traders, and bards. In Anatolia, in the islands of the Aegean and across the Mediterranean, the name of Troy became a symbol of both glory and tragedy. The ruins of the city stood as a silent monument, its stones blackened, its towers broken, a reminder of how pride and vengeance could undo even the greatest of kingdoms. The gods too were remembered for their part. Hera's grudge, Athena's cunning, Aphrodite's promise, Apollo's wrath, all were woven into the tale. The immortals had chosen sides, and in doing so had shown that even divine favor could not protect a city from fate. For in the end it was not strength nor beauty nor wisdom that decided Troy's fate, but the relentless hand of destiny. Generations passed, yet the story endured. Bards recited it by firelight, shaping it into song. They told of Achilles' wrath, of Hector's courage, of Priam's sorrow, and of Aeneas's flight. These songs, carried from mouth to ear, became the epics we know as the Iliad and the Odyssey. In later centuries, poets like Virgil would give the tale new life in the Aeneid, binding the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome, and ensuring its place in the foundation of Western memory. The aftermath of Troy was not only ruin, but rebirth. From its ashes rose myths that shaped identity, art, and culture for thousands of years. Its heroes became models of bravery and folly, of pride and loyalty. Its women, whether Helen, Cassandra, or Andromache, became voices of beauty, prophecy, and grief. And its city, though reduced to rubble, became eternal in story. Even in distant times, rulers and nations would look back to Troy, tracing their lineage to its survivors, claiming its legacy as their own. For in the fall of Troy lay a universal truth, that war consumes victors as well as vanquished, and that memory can outlive stone. The war was over, but the story had only begun. And through the centuries, from Greece to Rome, from the halls of kings to the lips of wandering singers, the tale of Troy endured, reshaped and retold, a mirror of human greatness and human weakness. The war for Troy ended long ago, its towers reduced to ash, its people scattered to the winds. Yet the story never truly died. From the ruins of that city arose a legend so vast, so enduring, that it has lived longer than the walls of Troy themselves. The names echo still. Achilles, the mightiest of warriors, who chose a brief life of glory over the long shadows of obscurity. Hector, defender of his city, who stood not for ambition but for love of family and homeland. Odysseus, whose cunning turned the tide of war, and whose restless journey home became a saga of endurance. Priam, whose grief softened even the heart of his enemy. And Helen, the most beautiful of mortals, who became both muse and curse, blamed and worshipped in equal measure. These figures, though born of myth, feel as real as the stones beneath our feet. They embody not perfection, but the struggles and choices of humanity, pride and honor, wrath and mercy, loyalty and betrayal. Through them, the ancients asked the same questions that still haunt us today. What is the price of pride? What is the meaning of honor? What will we sacrifice for love, for vengeance, for glory? The poets who shaped these stories, Homer in Greece, Virgil in Rome, gave them voice that carried across centuries. Around hearths and in crowded halls, listeners leaned close as bards sang of the wrath of Achilles, the fall of Hector, the burning of Troy. These songs were not merely entertainment, they were memory, identity, a way for people to understand themselves and the world around them. And so the Trojan War, whether history or myth, became more than a single tale. It became a foundation stone of Western imagination. It influenced the laws and the literature of Rome, the plays of Shakespeare, the verses of modern poets. Artists painted its battles, sculptors carved its heroes, composers gave it sound, filmmakers gave it light. Each age, in its own way, has found itself reflected in the dust of Troy. Perhaps this is why the story still holds us. It is not only about gods and warriors, but about us, about the choices that define us, the anger that consumes us, the love that redeems us, about the knowledge that even the greatest walls can fall, yet memory and meaning can endure far beyond stone. Troy may have burned, but its fire has lit centuries of human imagination. Its heroes still walk with us in the stories we tell, in the lessons we pass down, in the eternal question of what it means to live, to fight, to lose, and to be remembered. And so as the tale of the Trojan War fades into quiet, it leaves behind not ruin but resonance. The voices of Achilles and Hector, of Andromache and Priam, of Odysseus and Aeneas still echo like distant music carried on the winds of time. The city is gone, the heroes are dust, but their story is eternal.